Okay, let's unpack this. We've put together a fantastic stack of sources here, all about one of history's most enduring and fascinating subjects, Rome.
Hmm.
We're not just diving into the dates and battles, but really exploring the idea of Rome. We've got articles, research notes, even excerpts from a great summary of historical accounts.
Yeah.
Our mission for this deep dive is to take all this material and understand what that collective consciousness, that Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome really meant. How did that sense of identity evolve over centuries of massive change? And, why does it still feel so special?
Right. What was the foundation?
Exactly. What was the cultural foundation that could sustain such a huge idea?
Yeah.
We're going to dig into the legends, the reality, the triumphs, the civil wars, and the incredible adaptability that kept Rome going for, millennia.
Exactly. We'll trace the story from its mythical beginnings and the challenges of early history through the struggles of the Republic, the tumultuous rise of the empire, the major crises it faced, and the dramatic transformations that followed. It's a history marked by incredible building and innovation, but also, let's be honest, often by brutal violence, driven by ambition, and a remarkable capacity to adapt.
Absolutely.
We'll look at specific details and anecdotes from the sources that really bring the Roman character to life and help us understand not just what they did, but crucially, why it mattered and what it tells us about them.
So right at the start, sources point out a pretty significant challenge. The earliest Roman records are agonizingly absent.
Yeah, that 390 BC sack.
Exactly. The city was famously sacked and burned by Gauls in 390 BC, destroying much of what came before. So instead of definitive historical records, we rely on Roman legend.
And this is where things get interesting from the sources we examined. One perspective describes these early legends as completely ahistorical, going so far as to call it hella propaganda.
Hella propaganda, wow.
Yeah. But it's vital because later Romans themselves didn't have clear records of their earliest roots. They were curious and consciously compiled a narrative from these myths.
They essentially decided to devise one that fit, sort of reverse engineered their own origin story.
Pretty much. And the key mythical origin story we get starts with a descent from the Trojan hero Aeneas, though some sources note this connection comes via Greek accounts and feels suspiciously like an Odyssean journey grafted onto Roman origins.
A bit convenient, perhaps.
You could say that. And there was a hefty 4th-century gap between Aeneas, who's back in the Bronze Age, and Romulus, the supposed city founder around 753 BC. This chronological gap needed explaining.
Right. 4 centuries is a long time to just skip.
Exactly. Sources indicate that figures like Dionysius of Halicarnassus in the 1st century BC essentially invented the concept of the Alban kings to bridge this gap. Apparently, these kings lack real characterization. They're just names mapped onto old place names.
So it's like he was saying, yeah, that hill over there, totally named after this real ancient king, trust me.
Basically, no historical sources to back it up. Just trust us. But the story gets way more dramatic with Romulus and Remus, born to Rhea Silvia, who was, let's just say, divinely impregnated by the god of war, Mars.
Gotta have that divine connection.
Oh, yeah. A necessary touch of divine parentage there. They were later sentenced to be killed by being thrown in the Tiber, but were saved and nursed by a she-wolf on the banks of the river before being found and raised by shepherds.
The she-wolf. Iconic.
Absolutely. So, as one source puts it colorfully, their combined parent count is 1 dad, 2 moms, 1 god, and a wolf.
Quite the family tree. They grew up, deposed their great-uncle Amulius, and decided to found a new settlement along the Tiber, which is where the 753 BC date comes from.
But it wasn't smooth sailing.
No. This quickly led to a brotherly quarrel while plotting the city walls, and Romulus killed Remus. One source dryly calls this the first, but distinctly not last, Roman-on-Roman violence. And that's why it's called Rome, not Rome.
Now, when we look critically at this legend through the lens of our sources, there are some important notes. That 753 BC founding date, it's a 1st century BC guess, seemingly just to line up with the earliest Greek Olympics.
Ah, okay, so it wasn't based on actual records from 753.
Not likely. The entire story feels retrofitted to clean up the chronology between Aeneas, the city's actual likely founding sometime in the mid-700s, and the Republic's establishment in 509 BC. Everything else feels like narrative scaffolding added much later.
Even ancient historians like Livy question parts of the story, right? Like the divine birth and the she-wolf.
Yeah, Livy himself was skeptical, and the idea of 7 kings ruling for a combined 244 years, averaging 35-year reigns, that seems highly improbable. It's a length of rule matched by only 2 later emperors in over 1,000 years of imperial history.
That average reign length does sound optimistic.
Very. Republican-era Romans actually seemed to struggle with the idea of having 2 founders, Aeneas and Romulus. It wasn't until the Augustan period that they squared it, portraying Aeneas as founding the dynasty and Romulus the city.
Interesting, so they tidied it up later.
Exactly. Interestingly, other classical states didn't seem to have this much trouble with contradictory narratives or multiple origin heroes, like Athens with Theseus, but Rome felt compelled to force its disparate threads into one continuous, slightly cleaned-up narrative.
And the key takeaway here is that the legend didn't need to be factual. It just needed to fit the Romans' view of themselves.
Precisely. This origin myth, even if historically inaccurate, functions as a powerful cultural artifact. It tells us what Romans needed to believe about themselves and what they wanted others to believe. That they had divine descendants from Venus and Mars, a lineage connecting them to the older Greek world.
That they welcomed people from diverse backgrounds, that civil war was perhaps inherent, that they had a strange fondness for wolves.
The wolf kink, as one source puts it.
And that they killed tyrants.
Yes, one source sums up the rest as just Livy's filler arcs. And 2 specific deeds attributed to Romulus in the legend point strongly forward and reflect later Roman identity in significant ways.
Okay, what are those?
First, there's the story of him welcoming Italy's dispossessed and outlaws into his new settlement and granting them citizenship. This enshrined a fundamental idea that regardless of social class or cultural background, you could become Roman.
That's huge. That inclusivity must have been key to their growth.
Absolutely. That incredibly inclusive concept, for its time, is a key part of what allowed Rome to grow into a pan-Mediterranean civilization. And alongside that aspirational idea is their deepest anxiety.
The brother killing brother part.
Exactly. Encapsulated in the fratricidal founder story, sources view this as Rome's original sin, a foundational crime that they would be doomed to repeat throughout their history, the ruinously blood-soaked hobby of civil wars.
A dark foreshadowing right from the start. So that's the legendary foundation. From there, our sources transition into the more historical focus after the Romans deposed the last king, Tarquin the Proud, and started the Republic, conventionally dated to 509 BC.
Right. This early Republican period is characterized by sources as a slow process of building institutions and gradually expanding their territory in central Italy. Again, the lack of early written records before that 390 BC Gaulish sack remains a challenge for historians trying to understand the specifics of this era.
Yeah, that missing info is tough.
Yep.
But sources clarified that Rome's initial motivation for expansion wasn't some grand blueprint for world conquest.
No, not at all. After shaking off Etruscan domination and suffering that traumatic Gaulish sack, they felt a deep need to fortify their immediate territory by pacifying threats right at their frontier.
Kind of like building buffer zones.
Exactly. This doctrine of expanding defense began in this period and, simply put, never finished. They dealt with enemies one at a time, and it wasn't some top-down 50-point plan for Mediterranean domination, but a set of evolving priorities renewed by successive generations who felt the need to secure their borders.
So early history involved a lot of spirited back and forth, with neighbors like the Etruscans, the tough Samnites, and later the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia in southern Italy.
Yep. And yes, sources confirm spirited often meant literally stabbing each other with spears. It was a rough neighborhood.
While this external conflict was ongoing, the city was also developing internally. They were building infrastructure, establishing magistrates like consuls, praetors, and censors.
To handle practical matters like food supply, public games, and registering citizens. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, didn't pass laws, but published influential opinions.
And most of these early magistrates and senators came from the old patrician noble families. The larger population of plebeians felt increasingly left out.
Understandably, they wanted a greater share of political and social rights. The plebeians were determined to gain those rights, and their strategy was quite unique.
The secession strategy.
Yeah. During campaigns against Rome's neighbors, the plebeians, who formed the majority of the army, would simply go on strike. They'd just go sit on a hill outside the city until the patricians in the Senate granted them rights.
Like the right to marry patricians, hold their own positions, elect tribunes.
Exactly. The right to serve as consul, even.
And sources confirm this strategy was surprisingly effective. Through these periodic secessions, by 287 BC, Plebeians and patricians were legally equal in everything but name. One source notes, good for them.
Good for them indeed. But it took over 2 centuries to achieve this, which highlights Rome's slow, careful, and often pragmatic approach to internal development.
Their expansion across the Italian peninsula was equally slow, right? Reaching only the Bay of Naples by the early 3rd century BC.
Exactly. They were intent on taking measured, careful steps, unlike the Macedonian conquests under Alexander the Great, which fractured by going too far too fast.
And that expanding defense philosophy meant Rome claimed to only fight in self-defense, believing the gods granted victory only for just and pious wars.
Yeah, there's a catch. Sources add a crucial caveat. If Rome even suspected someone might attack them, they would absolutely shoot for it defensively.
Defensively aggressive, got it.
Pretty much sums it up. This philosophy led to conflict with Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king who came to protect the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia. He won 2 significant battles against the Romans.
But the cost was huge.
Devastating losses of his best troops, he eventually abandoned the campaign.
This gave us the term Pyrrhic victory, winning a battle, but at such a ruinous cost that it feels like a defeat. Sources note Pyrrhus's inability to not burn through a third of his army in these victories.
After Pyrrhus left, Rome absorbed Magna Graecia. Sources suggest they were relatively kindish to conquered peoples, often keeping existing local systems in place, unlike some conquerors who would torch it and start over.
But they do note one major exception to this relative leniency.
Ah, yes. The Punic Wars.
The long, tough conflict with Carthage, which one source calls the salty chapter in Roman history. Sources attribute the start of the First War around 264 BC, roughly, to a miscommunication with some Sicilian pirates.
That's right. Both Rome and Carthage, growing powers in the Mediterranean, were called to Sicily to settle a fight between Syracuse and some rowdy pirates, and they essentially just tripped face first into war with each other instead. Whoops.
Our sources really focus on the Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BC, and the figure of Hannibal. They emphasize how viscerally terrifying the mere mention of his name would have been to any Roman during this period.
Oh, absolutely. Hannibal demonstrated incredible tactical brilliance early on, winning battles in northern Italy using guerrilla and ambush tactics. What's truly remarkable is that he stayed in Italy, effectively behind enemy lines, for 16 years.
16 years, with no real support.
Next to no means of supply or reinforcement from Carthage, ravaging the countryside and burning farms to try and force Roman surrender.
And sources highlight one battle in particular 2 years into his Italian campaign, Cannae. In 216 BC, Hannibal decided to destroy the entire Roman field army. Sources describe Hannibal's plan, a U-shape of infantry in the center, with cavalry on the wings. The Roman army was almost twice as big and felt supremely confident.
Too confident, perhaps. As the fighting progressed, the Carthaginian center intentionally fell back and the Romans pushed forward, believing they were winning.
Walking right into the trap.
Exactly. But at that moment, the experienced Carthaginian African infantry on the flanks and the famed Numidian cavalry, which had routed the Roman cavalry, closed in and effectively enveloped the entire massive Roman army.
From there, it was a bloodbath. Estimates vary, but the general consensus is that most of the 80,000-strong Roman army was killed or imprisoned.
It was the single greatest defeat Rome ever suffered, losing 16 legions and control of the entire south of Italy. Hannibal expected Rome to surrender after this.
But they didn't.
No. Rome's response, according to sources, was simply, see ya next year. They spent the entire winter raising new armies. One source vividly calls this sheer quintessential Roman badassery and notes it took serious and massively suicidal Coleones to not give up after such a disaster.
Incredible resilience. For the next several years, the main Roman strategy against Hannibal in Italy was described as just bother him.
Yeah, they shadowed him around the Italian countryside. Since he couldn't directly attack the heavily fortified city of Rome, they contained him and avoided direct confrontation. A war of attrition, really.
Meanwhile, in 211 BC, a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio took up the generalship for the Spanish campaign, which was widely considered a dead man's quest.
Yeah, after previous Roman defeats there. But to everyone's surprise, he spent the next 5 years successfully decarthagifying Spain.
Following that success, he hatched a brilliant plan. Take the fight back to Carthage itself in North Africa. The Senate, still reeling from Hannibal's presence in Italy, thought it was another suicide mission.
And wouldn't officially finance his armies. Typical Senate caution, maybe.
Probably. So Scipio took matters into his own hands. He raised a couple of legions from willing volunteers in Italy and Sicily and just hopped over to North Africa anyway. As one source puts it with exasperation, why would anything else be what happened?
You just knew he would. Our sources contrast Scipio's brilliance with Hannibal's. Hannibal was known for doing impossibly crazy stuff like crossing the Alps with elephants or that 16-year campaign.
Right, the sheer audacity.
Scipio's brilliance, however, came from what sources identify as a quintessentially Roman ability, the capacity to adopt and adapt. The Romans learned from their defeats. They almost never made the same mistake twice.
Ah, like learning from Cannae.
Exactly. Scipio studied the disaster at Cannae and learned how to defeat Carthage. Crucially, he leveraged a Numidian civil war in North Africa to gain the support of Numidian cavalry, which had been a critical component of Hannibal's army, turning their own weapon against them.
Smart. He had significantly weakened Carthage on their own soil and forced their hand. Hannibal was eventually recalled from Italy to defend Carthage. Before the final battle, Hannibal sought peace talks.
But Scipio wasn't having it. One source recounts Scipio's legendary reply, something along the lines of, well, I was going to make peace, but then you brought an army here. I can't just leave now. I've just got to kick your ass, student. Sorry, there's no other way. I have to kick your ass.
Classic Roman bluntness.
And according to sources on the following day, some asses were indeed kicked at the Battle of Zama in 292 BC. Scipio's Numidian cavalry routed the Carthaginian cavalry. The infantry fight was close until the Roman cavalry returned and effectively enveloped the Carthaginian army, just like at Cannae, but this time it was the Romans doing the enveloping, a decisive Roman victory.
The aftermath for Carthage was brutal. Carthage asked for peace and was forced to burn its fleet, give up almost all its territories, and pay a massive annual tribute to Rome.
Sources describe Rome's attitude towards Carthage as, Rome hates you so much they wipe your empire off the face of the earth forever. Bitter. The moral. Don't screw with Rome. Salt or not, that much is true.
Message received. So with Spain and North Africa now effectively Romanized, Rome's focus shifted eastward. This eventually culminated in the conquest of Greece in 146 BC, infamously involving destroying the city of Corinth.
Yeah, where sources note they murdered and/or enslaved every man, woman, child, and artifact. Grim stuff.
Sources emphasize that violence was undeniably a key ingredient of Roman statecraft abroad. And given the thin line between the military and political establishments in Rome, it shouldn't be surprising that this instinct for violence would eventually turn inward. One source notes this with a foreboding,
Oh, no, indeed. And with that dark turn, we meet the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. While plebeians, they came from the highest Roman nobility sons of a consul and general, and maternal grandsons of Scipio Africanus himself.
Wow, that's serious pedigree.
Top tier. The elder brother, Tiberius, became tribune of the plebs and proposed significant land reform. He suggested limiting ownership of public lands acquired by the state during wars to half a square mile per person.
That actually sounds kind of reasonable.
It did seem seemingly reasonable to many, but was fiercely opposed by many senators who were illegally occupying and profiting from that very land. Their livelihoods were threatened.
And their opposition wasn't just political debate, was it?
Not even close. They grabbed clubs and chairs and proceeded to beat Tiberius to death in a riot. Sources note this takes intent and a good deal of persistence. This tragic event in 133 BC marked the first time the Roman instinct for violence had turned inward and stained Republican politics.
The line was crossed.
A blood-red line was crossed, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. Other tribunes were killed by senators later. Gaius, understandably holding a deep grudge because his brother was fucking assassinated, followed him into politics, becoming tribune years later and pursuing his own package of reforms.
What did he try to do?
He limited the Senate's power to prosecute citizens without the Assembly's consent and forbade anyone deposed by the Assembly from holding other offices.
Again, sounds aimed at curbing Senate power.
It was. While seemingly reasonable reforms, sources also point out they represented a power grab for the Assembly, noting it was simply realpolitik in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. Gaius also advocated for establishing Roman citizen colonies in new provinces like Carthage and Italy,
which also faced opposition.
Strong opposition from a new tribune. Gaius responded by triggering illegal protests against this opposition, which led to scuffles where one of his supporters was killed. The Senate feared this was escalating into a classic Gracchi brothers power grab attempt using mob violence.
So they acted decisively.
Extremely decisively. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an ultimate decree branding Gaius and his allies as enemies of the state and granting authorities the power to strategically unalive them.
Strategically unalive them. Chilling euphemism.
Isn't it? One source comments that the senators partied afterwards like it's 133 BC. Gaius and his supporters fortified themselves on the Aventine Hill. The consul raised a mob and soldiers to attack them. While sources differ on the exact details, Gaius likely fell on his own sword rather than being captured. So technically.
Technically, as one source notes, technically, he specifically was not actually assassinated. But around 3,000 of his supporters were brutally killed during and after the riot.
Just awful. And the precedent was set.
Exactly. Sources highlight that this left a chilling template for targeted political violence that later Romans were all too eager to follow. In the years that followed, most of Gaius's laws were repealed, but the underlying issues and calls for reform remained contentious. Crucially, political violence, once unthinkable, became frighteningly commonplace. The Gracchi era, as one source concludes, simply made it far easier to be bad.
This internal political instability contributed to major crises, like the Social War in 91 BC.
Fought over citizenship for Italian allies. It nearly toppled the state, but ultimately ended with all Italians gaining full Roman citizenship. The equestrian class also significantly benefited from some of Gaius's reforms, gaining vast economic and political power without Senate checks. And this descent into violence culminated in the civil wars of Marius and Sulla. Gaius Marius, a massively popular 7-time consul and leader of the Populares faction,
versus Lucius Sulla, a successful general and leader of the Optimates faction, notably among those who had sanctioned the killing of the Gracchi supporters.
And Sulla took things to a whole new level, didn't he?
Oh, yes. When Sulla returned from a campaign in the east, he took the unprecedented step of marching his army into Rome itself, establishing himself as dictator and carrying out brutal massacres of his rival Populares. He did this, incredibly, twice.
It's a rapid and terrifying decline. Sources point out that in just 50 years, Rome went from not a single Roman being killed over politics to armies marching on the capital and instituting prescribed hit lists of political enemies.
Things were really, really bad throughout the 1st century BC. The key insight from this period is how the Republic, despite its outward strength and gradual growth, was fundamentally vulnerable to internal division and the ambition of powerful individuals. The foundations built over centuries could unravel with terrifying speed once violence entered the political equation.
With that era of collapse underway, let's introduce a figure who would forever change Rome: Julius Caesar. One source begins his story not with battles, but with a telling yarn about some Cilician pirates.
Ah, the pirate story. It's a good one. When Caesar was a young man in his early 20s, he was captured by pirates and held for a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Sources estimate a talent was worth around $1 million in modern terms, so this was a significant amount.
And Caesar's reaction.
According to the story, he didn't just accept the ransom, he straight up laughed at the pirates and demanded they ask for a much more respectable 50 talents instead.
50 talents. That's
Sure.
a whole.
Extremely. The pirates, surprisingly, were charmed by Caesar's overwhelming diviness and, as one source there colorfully puts it, his razor-sharp cheekbones. They were apparently happy to keep him around for entertainment. He joined their games, told them stories, and even wrote poems and speeches for them.
Playing the captive entertainer.
And when they'd critique his work, Caesar would jokingly threaten to come back later and crucify every last one of them when he got free. The pirates, of course, found this hilarious.
Uh-oh. I sense where this is going.
The outcome. The ransom was paid, Caesar was freed, and as sources note, about 5 seconds later, he raised a fleet, tracked down pirates, and crucified every last one of them, exactly as he had promised. One source simply states, "Dude did not screw around."
Wow. That story, whether entirely true or embellished, highlights Caesar's audacity, confidence, and ruthless follow-through qualities that would define his career and exploit the growing fragility of the Republic.
Absolutely. Anyone with enough connections and resources and the nerve to use them could effectively challenge or cripple the government. Caesar didn't just say so, he was willing to fill the city with legionaries to back it up.
For his year as consul in 59 BC, Caesar was protected by his official authority, his imperium. But once that expired, he needed to keep it to avoid becoming a target for his many enemies in the Senate.
Right. So his next move was to secure a long-term governorship in a province with command of legions, giving him a metric buttload of military imperium to campaign and build power for the next 10 years until he could legally run for consul again.
Some senators, fearing this, tried to give him a less powerful assignment, something minor like governorship of the Italian woods.
Cute. But Pompey and Crassus, his allies in the First Triumvirate, used their considerable power, described by one source simply as coins and stabby things, to overturn that and secure him the governorship of southern Gaul and command of 4 legions.
So Caesar got his legions and his province, and he spent the next 10 years campaigning extensively in Gaul. We know an immense amount about these campaigns because Caesar himself wrote extensive commentaries detailing his actions.
Which served a dual purpose, right?
Exactly. He could justify his lengthy and often brutal campaigns year after year by showing everyone back home how effective he was and building public support through these widely read accounts. A definite win-win-win. Those sources do admit that Caesar's commentaries are hideously boring to actually read.
Fair enough. To quickly summarize his Gaul campaign, it often began with flimsy pretexts, like attacking the Helvetii in 58 BC because they were supposedly threatening an ally. Soon, he claimed tribes revolted to justify conquering them, like the Veneti way out in Finisterre in 56 BC.
So he was basically creating his own justifications as he went.
It increasingly seemed that way. He started acting like Gaul was functionally already his, Rome's. He even launched punitive expeditions into Germany and attempted invasions of Britain in 55 and 54 BC, claiming they were threats to Gaul and Rome.
He famously bridged the Rhine to attack German tribes, leaving half the bridge standing as a "don't you make me come back there" warning.
Classic Caesar move. His return to Britain in 54 BC with a massive fleet pushed as far as the Thames, partly just to prove Rome wasn't a pushover after the first attempt was a bust. He also lost a legion to an ambush that winter, highlighting the cost.
His biggest challenge came in 52 BC with a rebellion led by Vercingetorix, culminating in the massive siege of Alesia.
Alesia. Caesar famously built a double set of fortifications walls around the besieged city and another set facing outwards to defend against incoming Gallic relief forces. Pure genius or madness?
One source describes Caesar rolling a natural 20 on his deception check during the final battle, sending a cavalry detachment to attack the relief forces from the rear, causing them to panic and rout because they thought it was a full Roman reinforcement.
Which broke the siege and allowed Caesar to take the city. Boom! That's how you do a campaign. The next 2 years were spent finishing the pacification of Gaul. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the First Triumvirate collapsed. Crassus died on campaign in Parthia.
And Pompey.
Pompey, increasingly aligned with Caesar's enemies in the Senate, got the Senate to rescind Caesar's governorship of Gaul, effectively ordering him to return to Rome as a private citizen vulnerable to prosecution. That's not a good sign for the Republic.
Caesar knew that returning without Imperium was a death sentence.
Absolutely. So, feeling his options were gone, he reportedly said, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, and brought the 13th Legion, his loyal troops, over the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy. By doing so, he explicitly broke Roman law and started a civil war.
No turning back then. Pompey and most of the Senate.
They promptly, right the hell out of town, and fled to Greece to raise an army. Caesar quickly marched on Rome, roused the support of the people, and was controversially proclaimed temporary dictator with the stated goal of restoring peace.
Despite being the one who started the war. But, as a source notes, details.
Against many expectations, Caesar absolutely demolished Pompey's army in Greece at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered.
And Caesar's consolidation of power continued.
Yes. He then spent time in Egypt, famously restoring Cleopatra to the throne, and later fought Pompey's sons in Spain at the Battle of Munda in 45 BC to end the last Republican resistance.
Sources summarize Caesar's character and methods. Did he pull super mega illegal stunts throughout his career? Absolutely. Did he make substantially beneficial reforms that the people loved once he was in power? Absolutely.
A complex figure, no doubt. But sources identify Caesar's first and final true mistake as assuming nobody could do to him what he had done to the Republic. In March of 44 BC, Caesar was named dictator for life, or dictator perpetual.
Which was basically king.
As one source puts it, basically king. And Rome still very specifically did not like kings. So on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, and about 60 other senators surrounded and killed Caesar in the theater of Pompey.
The irony. Killed in Pompey's theater. Sources suggest that seeing Brutus, his friend whom he had pardoned after Pharsalus as part of the conspiracy, was the moment Caesar accepted his fate and fell. covering his face.
Yeah, the idea that he had time for eloquent last words with 23 knives stabbing him seems unlikely.
The assassins may have seen themselves as liberators, restoring the Republic, but they drastically miscalculated.
Hugely. They didn't count on Caesar's massive popularity among the Roman people. As one source puts it, oh gee, I don't know, he was a generous and effective leader. Sources strongly disapprove of Caesar's methods of gaining power, but abhors his assassins, pointing out he had granted many of them clemency, and they repaid him by killing him.
The source mentions Dante putting Brutus and Cassius in the lowest pit of hell.
Exactly, for betraying their protector, reflecting this sentiment. The key insight from Caesar's career, according to our sources, is that he killed the Republic long before he was even named dictator.
How so?
His entire main political career, from his consulship onwards, was either distinctly unrepublican in character or explicitly illegal. He proved just how breakable the system had become, bribing his way into office, illegally ramming through legislation, intimidating opponents, escaping consequences through military power, commandeering state resources, marching a legion into Rome, declaring war on a fellow Roman for personal gain.
So the system itself was broken by his actions.
Fundamentally. By the time he was dictator perpetua, the Republic was fundamentally broken. The tradition of teamwork and consensus that had defined its success was replaced by single-man ambition and unilateral action. Caesar's actions provided a blueprint for strongmen that would ultimately lead to the end of the Republic.
So with Caesar dead, the obvious question, as posed by one source, is where do we go from here?
Big question. The assassins' miscalculation was immediate and severe. They thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic, but they hadn't accounted for his immense popularity among the Roman people, especially his veterans. They didn't get a warm welcome in Rome.
So who stepped into the vacuum? Mark Antony.
Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man and a current consul, immediately sought to fill the power vacuum. As consul, he worked out a temporary compromise. Amnesty for the assassins if Caesar's acts and appointments were ratified.
A balancing act.
For a moment. The Roman people initially liked Antony, but the Senate, still largely anti-Caesar, did not, especially Cicero, who launched blistering verbal attacks. After his consulship, Antony left Rome to govern Cisalpine Gaul.
Meanwhile, enter Octavian.
Enter Gaius Octavianus, Caesar's great-nephew, described by one source as decently close, was studying abroad at the time of the assassination. He rushed back to Rome, heard Caesar's will read, and found he had inherited not just Caesar's name, but more importantly, the loyalty of Caesar's vast network of veterans. As one source puts it, he was Caesar's son now.
And he was surprisingly effective for a teenager.
Incredibly. Octavian was surprisingly successful for his age, largely because, as sources describe, he was a brilliantly crafty manipulator of iconography and cultural symbolism, even managing the incredible feat of convincing Rome that Caesar had become a god, making himself the son of a god.
Powerful stuff. The politics after Caesar's death were incredibly complex, with alliances constantly shifting.
Because, as one source notes, most people just wanted to be on the winning side. Octavian, despite positioning himself as Caesar's heir, initially played a clever political game. He likely encouraged Cicero in the Senate to unleash his fiery speeches against Antony.
Playing both sides.
Seems like it. The Senate, being anti-Caesar, saw Antony as the greater and more immediate threat. They sided with the existing governor in Cisalpine Gaul against Antony and declared Antony an enemy of the state. The problem? The Senate didn't have a loyal army of its own.
But Octavian did.
Octavian did. He had promised Caesar's veterans huge sums if they remained loyal to him. So, in a stunning political maneuver, Octavian, the Caesar's avenger, temporarily allied with the Senate to fight Antony, a move one source calls purely politically expedient for him.
This led to the Battle of Mutina in 43 BC, where Octavian, fighting alongside two senatorial consuls, defeated Antony.
But the downside for the Senate was that both consuls were killed in the fighting, leaving Octavian in sole command of a large, victorious army.
And when the Senate asked him to give up his army?
Sources say his response was, that's a good one, no. He promptly marched on Rome with his troops, and despite his previous alliance with the Senate, instead allied with his former enemy Mark Antony and the less significant Lepidus.
Forming the Second Triumvirate.
They formed the Triumviri Re Publicae Constituende, officially the triumvirate for the reconstitution of the Republic, though one source translates it more simply as the three guys for making Rome not have civil wars again. This was formed by a vote of the plebeian assembly, granting them immense official power. But sources note this power came at a quite expensive cost. The Senate and many traditional Romans saw this triumvirate as the plebeian assembly, handing Rome over to a few Caesarinos playing dictator.
So there was hostility.
Considerable local hostility. To solve this problem, they reached back to Sulla's playbook and drafted a hit list, the infamous prescription.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Exactly. This targeted around 300 wealthy anti-Caesarian senators and over 2,000 landowners. Their funds and property were confiscated, allowing the triumvirate to conveniently accumulate insane amounts of money needed to pay their soldiers and finance their campaigns, all while eliminating political enemies.
The scale sounds horrifying.
It was. Starting with lists of 2,000 names, they rapidly ballooned, ultimately gutting over a third of the Senate. Sources call this period of domestic slaughter obviously pretty messed up, noting the triumvirs had Cicero killed and his head and hands displayed in the forum.
Grim. Using these ill-gotten funds, the triumvirs financed a campaign to hunt down Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had fled to the east.
And raised armies. Antony and Octavian led armies to Greece and met the assassins' forces at Philippi in 42 BC.
How did that battle go?
At Philippi, Antony defeated Cassius's wing and Cassius killed himself. On the other wing, Brutus overran Octavian's camp, but Octavian conveniently wasn't there and survived. As one source notes, for some reason he wasn't there. Suspicious. Antony then defeated Brutus's remaining forces, and Brutus also killed himself.
So the triumvirs won, but Antony did most of the work.
Clearly. Octavian's role was less distinguished. Sources point out that Philippi was likely the biggest disgrace in Octavian's career, and you can see him trying to compensate for it by emphasizing calculated military imagery and association with victorious generals like Agrippa for decades after.
After Philippi, the triumvirs nominally, somewhat, slightly reconstituted the Republic, carving up the Roman world among themselves.
Yeah. Octavian took the West, Italy, Spain, Gaul, Illyria. Antony took the rich east, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, etc., and Puer Lepidus got Carthage and some African coast, and as one source observes dryly, did not matter.
On paper, unified, but in reality,
Inherently unstable. Sources note the fundamental issue. 3 extremely ambitious men, each looking to follow Caesar's example of unilateral rule. Politics got even weirder.
Octavian quickly proceeded to alienate many in Italy by confiscating huge amounts of Italian land to give to his veteran soldiers as payment.
Which caused problems. In 40 BC, Antony's wife Fulvia led a revolt against Octavian in Italy and briefly captured Rome. Octavian quickly pushed them out and quashed the rebellion. After this, he did something utterly shocking to Roman sensibilities. He performed human sacrifices.
Human sacrifices. Romans didn't do that.
Exactly. He sacrificed 300 of the rebels on the altar of the deified Julius Caesar. Sources note this under Octavian's deeply distressing personality quirks, emphasizing it was deeply un-Roman. It demonstrated a ruthless and even fanatical side to his character.
Meanwhile, Sextus Pompey was still causing trouble.
Oh yeah, son of Pompey the Great became a colossal pain, controlling a significant navy and disrupting trade in the Mediterranean for 8 years. Octavian finally defeated Sextus Pompey with crucial help from his general Agrippa and Lepidus.
And Lepidus tried to make a power grab.
He did. When Lepidus then tried to claim Sicily for himself, Octavian simply took Sicily and Lepidus's army, effectively ending Lepidus's political relevance down to 2.
The final conflict was inevitable and came down to Octavian versus Mark Antony. Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia in 40 BC as a political alliance, but divorced her in 32 BC to formally marry Cleopatra VII of Egypt.
Confirming what everyone in Rome already knew about his relationship, one source notes this marriage mirrored the step where hostilities flared between Caesar and Pompey, signaling another civil war was coming. Get ready.
Octavian seized on Antony's actions, particularly the revelation of Antony's will,
which showed his intention to be buried in Alexandria and gift Roman lands to Cleopatra's children. This was framed in Rome as kingly behavior in service to a foreign state at Rome's direct expense. Perfect propaganda material.
Octavian, the master manipulator, pounced. He launched an intense propaganda war, branding Antony as a once great Roman corrupted and bewitched by a scary foreigner, Cleopatra, who had supposedly forgotten how to be Roman.
While Octavian, meanwhile, painted himself as the pinnacle of Romanness, carefully tracing his family heritage back to Aeneas.
Key propaganda tools included Octavian beginning construction on a giant, elaborate mausoleum in Rome itself.
As a deliberate giant middle finger to Antony's supposed wish to be buried in Alexandria. Crucially, framing the conflict as a war against Cleopatra and a foreign threat avoided the touchy subject of civil war among Romans. Control over the narrative was absolutely key to Octavian's strategy.
Leading up to the final confrontation at Actium in 32 BC, Rome was largely convinced the true antagonist was Cleopatra in Egypt, not Octavian's personal power play against Antony.
Right. Octavian's earlier controversial land redistribution had paid off, securing the loyalty of his battle-hardened legions. His general Agrippa also played a crucial role, preventing Antony from sailing to Italy to challenge Octavian directly.
The Battle of Actium itself in 31 BC was, as one source describes it, surprisingly anticlimactic, even meh.
Yeah. Agrippa forced the naval battle, and then Cleopatra and Mark Antony broke through the blockade with part of their fleet and famously bailed, sailing back to Egypt. As one source notes, quote, leaving and losing was better than likely losing anyway, plus being captured and probably killed because, honestly, fair. Most of their remaining forces defected to Octavian shortly after.
The source notes that historians influenced by Roman and Octavianic propaganda have often treated Cleopatra poorly,
painting her as one-dimensional and evil, which it argues is a woefully inaccurate characterization. She was a formidable ruler in her own right.
After Actium, Octavian pursued Antony and Cleopatra to Egypt and cleaned up, officially annexing the Duat out of Egypt in 30 BC. The not a civil war was finally won, and the Roman world was, for the first time in decades, truly at peace.
Factors in Octavian's victory included his superior strategy, often executed by his exquisite team Agrippa, his brilliant general, and Maecenas, Rome's biggest patron of arts and crucial for running the propaganda war. Sources acknowledge his tactics were often underhanded and downright brutal.
Ultimately, Octavian's victory reassembled Rome into one piece after a century of civil strife. It demonstrated, perhaps decisively, that the only way to keep the vast Roman world together was to have one man in charge.
At barely 35 years old, Octavian was the most powerful man in Rome. He had cleverly positioned himself as the heir of the deified Caesar, temporarily allied with Antony for revenge on the assassins, consolidated his power base in the west, painted Antony as a foreign corrupted turncoat, and annexed the immense wealth of Egypt.
But despite the peace and his unparalleled power, the fundamental question remained: how could the Republic really be restored if there was one man clearly more powerful than anyone else?
Indeed. The transition from republic to empire wasn't a preordained path, but Augustus, as Octavian became known, demonstrating his endless cleverness, pulled it off.
His first crucial move upon returning from Egypt was to astutely dodge the question of being king, a title Romans still hated. Instead, he insisted he was simply restoring the Republic.
A phrase one source compares to Bane returning power to the people, saying Augustus was returning it to you, the people. Very clever framing.
He retired the title of Triumvir and formally resigned most of his extraordinary official powers in 27 BC. B-U-T. And it's a big but.
Oh, yeah. He strategically retained key positions and authorities. He remained consul for years, held governorships over the provinces with the most troops, Egypt, Spain, Gaul, and Syria. He held tribunician authority, which made his person sacred, and retained imperium over all other proconsuls and provincial governors.
So, in effect, he held more consolidated power than any one man before him. But it was, as sources describe, clothed in layers of republican legitimacy.
Exactly. He preferred the humble-sounding title princeps, meaning first citizen. Sources note that Rome kept its mouth shut and accepted this new reality, while Augustus shrewdly kept personal control of Egypt and its vital grain supply.
On the foreign policy front, Augustus consolidated Rome's borders, largely establishing the empire's extent for the next few centuries. He notably secured a peace agreement with the Parthian Empire,
who had been a particularly troublesome thorn for decades. Domestically, he carefully selected senators, magistrates, and generals loyal to him, ensuring the system ran smoothly under his guidance.
A crucial part of his program was a vast literary initiative. He heavily patronized poets like Virgil, whose epic Aeneid glorified Rome's mythical Trojan history,
and connected Rome's lineage back to Aeneas, Venus, and Mars, making Augustus and his Julian family inextricable from the very concept of Rome's glorious past. It was brilliant propaganda woven into high art.
This literary program was part of a larger Augustan program that spanned arts, literature, and architecture, all celebrating Rome's revived glory and Augustus's central role in it.
Nowhere was this more visible than in architecture, arguably his most celebrated accomplishment. Sources cite the famous quote attributed to him by Suetonius, that he found Rome as a city of bricks and leaving it as a city of marble.
Sources note that this building program was a natural extension of his Weasley talent for propaganda and projecting an image of renewed Roman greatness. Before Augustus, Rome, while having a long history, lacked the monumental grandeur of older Hellenistic capitals.
Yeah, it was built on 7 hills, had the old Servian wall and Pomerium boundary. The sacred line armies were forbidden to cross, though they often did. The city core was within the Pomerium. Everything else was just sort of belongings.
And frankly, Rome's belongings, great cities like Athens, Ephesus, and especially Alexandria, were often far more impressive than Rome itself. Republican Rome lacked the massive public works we associate with the empire. No Colosseum, no Pantheon.
No vast imperial palaces, no huge public baths. Only recently had Caesar built a major forum and upgraded the Circus Maximus, which still had wooden bleachers. Pompey's stone theater and its attached Senate house was the single nicest building. Compared to Alexandria with its temples featuring holy water vending machines and a magnificent library, Rome, sources suggest, desperately needed to step up its game.
So Augustus embarked on an extensive building spree. He established public libraries, notably one in a new temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, housing both Greek and Roman literature, and another outside the Pomerium in the portico of Octavia.
Further outside the Pomerium, he built a massive ornate mausoleum for himself and his family. This was a significant symbolic act, signifying his commitment to Rome by his intention to die and be buried there.
And also, as one source gleefully points out, a giant middle finger to Mark Antony's supposed wish for an Alexandrian tomb.
Can't resist the petty dig, even in stone. A key location for many of Augustus's projects was the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, traditionally used for military assembly because it was outside the Pomerium and the restriction on armies.
Right. Here, he built the magnificent temple to Mars altar, Mars the Avenger, as the centerpiece of his new Forum of Augustus.
This temple explicitly celebrated his victory over Caesar's assassins, and the new forum became a central place for public business operating under the princeps' direct patronage. This forum also featured statue galleries showcasing famous men of the Republic alongside statues of the Julian family lineage, tracing all the way back to Aeneas, both culminating, of course, in Augustus himself.
Very subtle. He also finished the Site Julia, a vote-counting hall commissioned by Caesar,
further associating the machinery of government with his own patronage. One source calls this clever bastard, but clever.
Another notable structure in the Campus Martius with a more cosmic scope was the Solarium Augusti,
which incorporated an Egyptian obelisk as a massive sundial or meridian, tracking the Julian calendar. This celebrated the subjugation of Egypt and subtly conveyed that the Julio-Augustan family literally controlled time.
Controlling time itself. Ambitious. He also built the impressive Theater of Marcellus, named in honor of his deceased nephew, and made it bigger than Pompey's theater.
A touch the source calls petty, though significantly less obnoxious than proclaiming yourself the ruler of time. Fair point.
And he allowed his incredibly capable right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa, to show off with major building projects.
Agrippa constructed the first version of the Pantheon, tragically domeless at this stage, and crucially, the first major public baths in Rome, supplied by a new aqueduct, the Aqua Virgo.
Agrippa oversaw the construction of 2 of the 3 major aqueducts built under Augustus. The third supplied water to the Naumachia, an arena across the Tiber specifically built for staging naval battles.
Sources point out that this vital water infrastructure became another vehicle for propaganda, showcasing Augustus's care for the people and control over resources. Water equals power.
The centerpiece of this vast building program, according to sources, was the Era Pacis Augustae, the altar of Augustan peace,
which, despite its grand purpose, is described as strikingly humble in its physical scale compared to other projects. It was located strategically on the Campus Martius, symbolically linking Roman power, the new era of peace, the Pax Romana, and natural prosperity to the time king himself.
The Era Pacis, despite its size, was thick with symbolism, much of it self-serving, as one source notes.
The inside walls featured bountiful fruit garlands and ox skulls, evoking religious sacrifice and plenty. The bottom of the outside walls were covered in ornate floral patterns, featuring over 50 species of plants, originally painted and gilded, conveying natural beauty, fertility, and prosperity under Augustus.
The front panels depicted key origin stories: Aeneas sacrificing and the legendary founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus,
visually connecting the mythical founders to the present age of Augustus. There's a figure next to the founders that historians debate, which the source dismisses with a simple, not the main point.
The back panels show the goddess Roma in armor, seated on weapons, and another goddess, possibly Pax, Roma, Mother Earth, or Venus Genitrix, holding 2 children likely symbolizing the Roman people, surrounded by symbols of bounty from land and sea.
The combined effect of these panels was powerful. Here's what we came from, and look at us now, we did it. Golden Age ahoy.
The long sides featured processional friezes, perhaps referencing the Parthenon's famous sculptures, depicting a religious procession from 13 BC. These showed politicians, the senatorial elite, and crucially, the extended imperial family.
Including Augustus, his wife Livia, Agrippa, his daughter Julia, and their children. It represented the SPQR, but with a clear message. The people is Augustus's people, and specific individuals who mattered were included.
Even featuring a pretty adorable bored kid pulling on Agrippa's toga, a relatable touch amidst the vigorous propaganda.
The overall message conveyed by the Arapashis iconography was a complex mix of divine favor, ancestral lineage, a golden age of peace and prosperity, and the triumph of order and security, all presented as supporting Augustan political power and the concept of the princeps as a divinely favored patron.
Sources argue this iconography was so powerful, and the results seemed to fit the promises so well that Romans were willing to accept a form of monarchy again. The Arapachis became a focal point for interpreting Augustan rule and even consequential political arguments centuries later.
Our sources have an ambivalent view of Augustus, acknowledging he was endlessly clever, but also describing him as a lying, weaselly rascal for the deceptive way he acquired power.
But they concede the results were impressive.
Yes, they concede that the Arapachis, Augustan Rome, and the new identity forged for the empire were magnificent, while asking the lingering question, what did it cost them?
Not everything was perfect, of course. The famous poet Ovid was exiled by Augustus.
For writing poems about seduction and love, which didn't align with Augustus's moral reforms and marriage laws, one source notes of his actions were completely in character for the poet, even if ill-timed. Oops.
Augustus died in 14 AD at age 75.
Yeah.
By this time, most Romans couldn't remember the old republic.
Either because they were too young or, as one source puts it grimly, too murdered during the civil wars and proscriptions. Despite suffering recurring sickness, he outlived all his rivals, having outplayed everyone in Rome starting at age 19.
Augustus laid the groundwork for over 1,000 more years of Roman civilization in various forms. His ascent wasn't guaranteed, but he established the empire in 27 BC and presided over decades of peace.
This new age wasn't defined by chaotic conquests, but by the victorious quiet of the Pax Romana. Poets, artists, and architects codified the imperial identity, allowing Rome to step out of Greece's shadow and create its own distinct visual and cultural language.
The first 200 years, AD saw Rome at the top of its game, with the infrastructure and stability to make the most lavishly glorious civilization. It gives us an opportunity to look at the structure and scale of this success before things inevitably started to go wrong.
When we look at the Roman Empire after Augustus, especially the emperors themselves, the stories can often be train wrecks, largely filtered through biased historical sources.
Yeah, you have to take them with a grain of salt.
Definitely. It's often best to treat them as glorified timestamps showing who was in charge when. Succession was often messy after Augustus, leading to figures like Tiberius taking the throne. But before things completely went off the rails for good, the Pax Romana era saw Roman civilization flourish in remarkable ways.
A key highlight discussed in sources is Roman engineering concrete, domes, arches, aqueducts.
Which one source calls water highways that ferried delicious H2O.
Nice. And technologies like heated floors. One source jokes that Romans literally had no chill when it came to their construction projects.
Sources draw a contrast between the quiet vibrance of private Roman art and decoration and the massive public works. These were built for glory and function rather than pure aesthetic beauty.
So it was practical first.
You could say that. It was a practical, functional artistry where the beauty lies in the accomplishment and its usefulness, with purely aesthetic beauty being more of a flourish.
The single greatest monument to Roman extravagance mentioned in the sources is the Colosseum.
Built starting under Vespasian and finished by Titus in 80 AD. It was controversially built on land in the heart of Rome that had been cleared after Nero's Great Fire in 64 AD.
And financed by.
Largely financed by spoils from the brutal suppression of the Jewish revolt. This connects directly to the economics and resources that fueled Roman grandeur. The state owned vast quarries and brickyards, producing standardized materials on an industrial scale.
And crucially, sources emphasize the vital, pervasive role of slavery.
Absolutely critical. Around a quarter of the empire's population was enslaved and treated strictly as property, permeating every aspect of society. Slaves performed much of the back-breaking labor in mines, quarries, and construction, often alongside freedmen and other laborers.
And once finished, slaves fought in the arena. Gladiatorial games were, as one source puts it bluntly, fucking gnarly.
The sources don't shy away from the cognitive dissonance here. Romans would go to these magnificent, technically brilliant theaters like the Colosseum to watch people get fucking bodied. There seemed to be minimal concern for the cruelty and human cost behind these incredible accomplishments and entertainments.
It's a jarring contrast. Moving away from the city, provincial life offers another perspective. Britannia was added to the empire relatively late, during Vespasian's reign.
Right. The sources highlight how fast Rome could establish fully functioning cities like Londinium out of thin air. Their later provincial additions were often planned incredibly well, laid out with grids that one source simply calls beautiful.
Roman Britain is well documented, thanks partly to the historian Tacitus.
Whose father-in-law, Agricola, served as governor there. This was part of the process of Romanization, where populations considered barbaric would often take on Roman customs to become civilized.
But it wasn't a one-way street, was it?
Not at all. Sources stress that the vast diversity of cultures across the empire meant there was wide variety in what being Roman meant in practice. Rome was heavily influenced in turn by local cultures, languages, art, dress, and religion.
Roman religion itself was flexible and adaptable. They copy-pasted their pantheon and constantly saw crossover opportunities.
Performing what one source calls DBZ fusions on similar deities from different cultures, syncretism at its finest.
This stands in sharp contrast to Judaism, which was pointedly monotheistic and not open to merging deities.
Right. Rome and Judea had a frequently adversarial relationship after Pompey's conquest in 63 BC and a string of oppressive governors. This led to the major Jewish revolts starting in 66 AD.
Vespasian was initially put in charge, but delegated the war to his son Titus when he became emperor.
Correct. Jerusalem was eventually sacked and brutally looted, an event famously commemorated on the Arch of Titus in Rome, showing Roman legionaries carrying off the giant menorah from the temple. Jews went into diaspora after the destruction of the Second Temple.
There are echoes of this adversarial relationship with Christianity, another monotheistic religion initially considered subversive.
Yes. But for the first 2 centuries AD, persecution of Christians was sporadic and localized, not empire-wide policy. It varied a lot by region and emperor.
Titus's brief reign after Vespasian saw twin crises, another major fire in Rome, and the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius,
which wiped out the cities around the Bay of Naples like Pompeii and Herculaneum. After Titus died, his brother Domitian became emperor, known for more building projects, stripping more power from the Senate, and unfortunately following the trend of getting assassinated.
Seems like a risky job being emperor.
Increasingly so. This time, the succession crisis led to the Praetorian Guard forcing the new elderly Emperor Nerva to adopt the General Trajan as his heir. Despite this rather corrupt beginning, one source notes, this is where things start really getting shiny.
The good emperor's period begins. Trajan was a brilliant military master who pushed Roman territory to its greatest extent.
His famous triumphal column in Rome commemorated his conquest of Dacia, modern Romania, and the massive spoils from that campaign paid for more magnificent public works, including the last and grandest imperial forum in Rome, complete with 2 libraries. One source calls Trajan a real G for giving that wealth back to his people through public projects.
While his conquest of Mesopotamia was impressively flashy, sources point out it was completely untenable in the long term.
Exactly. His successor, Hadrian, had no interest in outward expansion, focusing instead on solidifying borders, like building fortifications in Britannia and Germania, and splashing money on grand monuments across the empire.
This period, spanning from Nerva through the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, is considered the high point of the Pax Romana.
Several decades of relatively pleasantly quiet history, characterized by, for the most part, wise rulers, internal stability, and a steady, prosperous empire. Sources describe this as Roman civilization at its best.
But sources also warn that Roman discipline and the system could lapse, and things could go ouch very quickly. The great SPQR, despite its strength, always maintained the potential for a remarkably precipitous drop.
Even during the Pax Romana, there were moments of crisis, but they were largely contained. What came next was not.
Sources highlight one period as a truly abysmal chapter in Roman history. The crisis of the 3rd century, starting after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it shattered the Pax Romana, and for a while the fall of the empire looked imminent.
As one source puts it, a lot of damage was done. But then somehow an emperor named Diocletian managed to flex-tape the empire back together with major reforms. And by the turn of the 300s, things were looking solid.
So what caused this 3rd century crisis?
It was multiple compounding problems. External threats surged, particularly Germanic tribes like the Goths and Alemanni, who were looking for new lands. Some moved peacefully, others forcefully, raiding deep into the empire, even sacking the city of Athens in 267 AD.
The army couldn't keep up.
Sources note the Roman army wasn't able to be strong enough everywhere simultaneously, and focusing the emperor and best troops on one frontier often left another open. This delegation of authority also led to ambitious generals scheming for the throne.
And the East wasn't quiet either.
Not at all. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians in the 220s AD, was far better organized and a significant outward threat, pushing into Armenia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. In 260 AD, King Shepur I of Persia even captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle.
The only Roman emperor ever captured by a foreign enemy.
Yep. Sources note Shapur then reportedly used Valerian as a literal footstool, which is pretty bad, as if being the emperor wasn't bad enough already.
And ouch. Internal problems were just as severe, right? Coin debasement, inflation.
Massive inflation. Emperors constantly needed money to pay and bribe their armies, leading to coins being heavily debased. Trade routes were disrupted by war and piracy, and vast regions were destroyed by invasions and counterattacks.
And plague.
A devastating plague in the 250s killed thousands daily in Rome and halved the populations of major cities like Alexandria, drastically reducing the labor force for farming and fighting, leading to widespread shortages. Piracy wasn't just external, it became rampant within the empire's borders, forcing cities and provinces to spend scarce resources building defensive walls and forts for self-protection.
So the Pax Romana society was just gone.
Pretty much. It required the stability of strong government and a reliable military, both of which were frequently absent. Government functions devolved to relying primarily on the army, often accountable only to their very stably general.
Sources suggest that if political and military foundations could be patched up, even just locally, things might hold. The first 3 decades of the crisis were bad, but they were tame compared to the fragmentation that occurred after Valerian's capture in 260.
Right. With Valerian captured, leadership fell to his son and co-emperor Gallienus, who, sources say, faced everything everywhere all of the time. He wisely delegated command of the crucial Rhineland frontier to Postumus, a capable general and governor.
And Postumus declared himself emperor.
Sources note it took all of 5 minutes for Postumus to be claimed as emperor by his troops. But unlike other usurpers who marched on Rome, Postumus only claimed authority over the western provinces, Britannia, Gaul, Germania, and Hispania, forming what sources call a quasi-intendant state.
So a breakaway empire.
Essentially, he set up parallel institutions like a senate and consuls. Sources suggest he had no intention of fighting Rome for the whole empire. He just wanted his slice, and he defended it fairly well against external threats.
A strikingly similar story played out in the east with Palmyra.
Very similar. Prince Odaenathus of Palmyra, a Roman client state in Syria, fought the Sassanids independently of Gallienus's direct control. He was entrusted with the defense of the east and granted governorships over several provinces, effectively ruling an essentially independent state allied to Rome.
But Odaenathus was assassinated.
In 267 AD. And his powerful widow, Zenobia, took over as de facto ruler and governor. Taking advantage of a rapid succession of weak emperors in Rome around 270 AD, Zenobia annexed Egypt and Galatia and openly proclaimed her son Imperator Caesar Augustus, a clear, open revolt.
How did Rome react to that?
Rome's reaction, according to sources, was painfully telling. The new emperor in Rome only seemed to care that the vital Egyptian grain exports stayed on schedule. The source notes it's painfully telling that he saw outright rebellion but thought, hey, I'll double back. More immediate problems.
Wow, priorities.
Interestingly, half of Egypt favored Zenobia's annexation, and sources suggest you can see why, given the chaotic alternative. Wild as it seems, sources argue that these breakaway states, the Gallic and Palmyrene empires, were actually less of a problem for Rome than constant usurping generals were.
How so?
They arguably helped by removing entire massive frontiers from the attention of the central emperor, unintentionally setting the stage for later reconquest.
And that reconquest was achieved by Emperor Aurelian.
Right. Reigned from 270 to 275 AD. He was granted the title Restitutor Orbis, or Restorer of the World. Sources note he was free to focus on defeating both external barbarian threats and internal usurpers. He drove the invading Alemanni tribe off the Italian peninsula in 271 and began building massive new walls around the city of Rome.
The Aurelian Walls, still standing today.
Large parts of them. He also wisely organized a retreat from the always slightly untenable province of Dacia north of the Danube, consolidating the border along the river. He first turned east, defeated Zenobia, and dramatically reconquered Palmyra by the end of 273. The next year, he turned west and reincorporated the Gallic state.
So he put it all back together.
In just a few intense years, Aurelian reunified the Roman world under singular authority. Being granted the title Restorer of the World by the Senate was, as sources note, no small praise.
But Rome wasn't out of the woods yet. Aurelian was tragically murdered by his own troops in 275 AD.
Yeah, that pattern continues. The following decade was described as kinda crap, with more squishy emperors, a non-functioning economy, and renewed Frankish invasions. However, these invasions presented an unexpected opportunity. Rome began employing Franks in rebuilding devastated areas along the frontier in exchange for letting them settle within Roman territory.
Integrating barbarian groups within the empire. That becomes a big deal later, right?
Huge deal. It wasn't until the long reign and comprehensive reforms of Diocletian from 284 to 305 AD that Roman authority finally came back on a truly stable footing.
What were his key reforms?
He issued stable currency, firmly separated military and civil leadership to stop the army muscling in on civilian government, and crucially, moved the western seat of government to Mediolanum, Milan, to better oversee the front, while he himself resided in Nicomedia in the east.
And the Tetrarchy.
His most significant reform, delegating regional authority, establishing the Tetrarchy, or rule by four. Diocletian was Augustus in the east, Maximian was Augustus in the west, and each chose a Caesar heir. Each emperor had considerable regional autonomy.
Sources describe this Diet federalism as a brilliant adaptation.
It turned the perennial problem of managing such a vast territory from one central location into a stabilizing strength by formally recognizing the geographic and administrative fault lines. Diocletian further snuffed out the threat of civil war by cutting provinces in half, creating around 100 smaller provinces, giving governors less power against a local tetrarch, and grouped these provinces into 12 regional dioceses, adding another layer the strata of administration.
One fascinating point sources make is that the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires essentially served as a trial run for Diocletian's policy.
Right. In an insanely trolley twist of fate, Rome was simply too large and fragile for one emperor to rule alone, so the solution was functionally to take it in parts. Diocletian's reforms made a fundamental difference, bringing Rome out of its deepest crisis onto a much more stable footing.
Sources argue that moments like these, when Rome stares down oblivion and refuses to die, are why people get truly excited about its history.
Perhaps more than the conquests. It's the persistence of the idea of Rome and its remarkable ability to adapt.
So this brings us to the famous, often debated, fall of Rome, going from arguably the greatest civilization of its time to not existing.
Yeah. Sources note there's huge historical debate why it fell, when exactly it fell, or even if it truly fell at all. They liken it to a game of Clue with many possible answers. Vandals in 455, Constantine in 312, Ottomans in 1453. Our sources frame it firmly as a long, complex process, not a single event.
Just a century after Marcus Aurelius, the Pax Romana was shattered by the crisis of the 3rd century, and the fall seemed imminent. But Diocletian's reforms seemed to flextate the empire back together, and by the turn of the 300s, things were looking solid again.
After 21 years of rule, Diocletian did something remarkable in 305 AD. He retired, the first Roman emperor to voluntarily do so. He went to live in his palace on the Adriatic coast, explicitly emulating the Republican hero Cincinnatus,
who saved Rome and then gave up power to return to his farm. Sources call this a monumental gesture, meant to declare the empire saved and celebrate the survival of traditional Roman virtues.
Lovely idea. One thing Diocletian didn't quite count on was that in his absence, the tetrarchs he had set up would immediately start fighting civil wars among themselves. As one source dryly comments, "When in Rome, sack it."
Back to civil war. In this period of refreshing return to form, where Rome's biggest enemy was itself, one of the new tetrarchs, a Western Caesar named Constantine, began conquering his rivals.
Right. During the fight for control of Italy, sources recount his famous vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, telling him to paint the symbol of Christ, the Chi-Rho, on his soldier shields.
And he won the battle. Did this mean he converted?
It's unclear if this represented a full personal conversion at the time, but he won the battle decisively. More importantly, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which legalized Christianity throughout the empire, ending the periods of sporadic persecution.
So Christianity became a team player.
Essentially, it could now be seen as compatible with the Roman concept of Pax Romana, where Rome maintained divine favor by being pious towards the gods. Earlier seen as subversive, now part of the system.
Constantine went on to defeat the remaining tetrarchs and reunify the entire empire under his rule in 324 AD. He then founded a new eastern capital at the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium,
calling it Nova Roma, New Rome, though it quickly became known as Constantinople. This site was strategically located at a crossroads, much closer to the richer eastern provinces.
Unifying such a vast empire while integrating a new religion must have been challenging.
Immensely. Christians themselves were fiercely debating theological issues, and sources note that Alexandrians started rioting over theological fine points. Constantine asserted imperial authority by convening the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to negotiate a universal orthodoxy that was legally binding.
One source calls this a slick move for co-opting a potentially disruptive force into Roman power structures.
These changes under Constantine marked the beginning of a formal divergence between the eastern and western parts of the empire, a process that accelerated after his death. His sons plunged into civil war. Later emperors struggled. Emperor Julian, described as a tragic introvert, famously attempted to revert the empire to paganism but failed.
And was killed in Persia. This division became permanent under Emperor Theodosius I in the 390s AD.
Yes. He mandated Nicene Christianity as the official state religion, another step in Christianization. More significantly for the empire's structure, he formally divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division proved permanent.
The timing of this permanent division was unfortunate for the West, but sources note this alone didn't doom them. It highlighted existing core issues.
Exactly. Sources discuss the so-called barbarian invasions, not as simple military invasions by hostile armies, but as a complex process of migration and negotiation. The term barbarian itself was co-opted from Greek,
Meaning non-Greek speakers applied to non-Romans. Many of these groups had been allied with Rome earlier.
Right. The trouble escalated when the nomadic Huns began pushing various Germanic tribes, particularly the Goths, Ostrogoths and Visigoths, forcing them to move. These groups often sought refuge within allied Roman territory. Emperors would sometimes negotiate these relocations, much like they had in the 3rd century crisis.
So the popular image of barbarian invasions obscures this complexity.
Sources argue it does, obscuring the process of movement, negotiation, failed treaties, and conflict. A key event occurred when some Visigoths, fleeing the Huns, asked and received permission via treaty from Constantinople to cross the Danube River into the Balkans.
The things went wrong.
They were joined by others who crossed illegally. Crucially, sources note, corrupt provincial generals treated them harshly, withholding promised supplies, which led them to revolt. This sparked a major conflict, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD.
Where the Gothic revolt leaders killed the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens. Sources describe this as a huge oh shit moment for the empire.
Absolutely, showing the vulnerability of his armies and even the emperor himself. Decades later, Alaric and the Visigoths, still seeking land and better treatment within the empire, took the shocking step of marching into Italy and sacking the city of Rome itself in 410 AD.
The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was immense.
Exactly. The ancient symbolic capital was now within striking distance. It was a real oh shart moment that echoed across the Roman world. More Western territory continued to break away in the early 400s as various groups, Goths, Franks, Vandals, flowed across the frontiers and established their own kingdoms within former Roman provinces.
The scariest external threat for a time was the Huns under Attila.
Yes. Attila's invasion saw him defeated in Gaul in 451 AD by a combined Roman and Visigothic army led by the Roman general Aetius. Attila invaded Italy the next year, but sources claim he was famously persuaded by Pope Leo XIV not to sack the city of Rome in 452.
It may be also influenced by plague and troop movements.
Plausible factors. However, Pope Leo had less success during the Vandal sack of Rome in 455 AD. He persuaded the Vandals not to burn the city or kill the inhabitants on the condition that they could plunder absolutely anything and anyone they wanted.
Which was Still pretty bad.
Understatement. The Federati, or treaty allies, increasingly acting like independent rulers within the West, sources question how the eastern half was faring by comparison.
Did the East just abandon the West?
The Byzantine defense strategy wasn't simply to make the West's problems Italy's alone. At the turn of the 5th century, Constantinople began building the Theodosian walls, massive triple-layered fortifications that sources describe as arguably the best urban fortifications in the world. They proved functionally impenetrable, surviving sieges for 1,000 years.
Wow, so the West problems were more internal.
Sources suggest its leadership played a significant role. Many later Western emperors are described as feckless, allowing relatively simple problems of managing migration and allied troops to boil over into internal conflict and the capital being sacked twice.
So the division didn't doom the West alone, but highlighted its core issues.
Exactly. West had less territory, less wealth, a less unified identity with more powerful local warlords. East was wealthier, more urbanized, centralized, stronger army-navy.
Despite the conventional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, sources emphasize that Roman identity persisted.
Absolutely. The lines between Roman and barbarian had blurred considerably, and many successor kingdoms, like the Gothic kingdoms in Italy, actually preserved Roman institutions like the Senate. Sources argue the Mediterranean world remained fundamentally Roman in character well into the 600s AD, until the rise of Islam dramatically reshaped the region.
So the death of the Roman Empire lands both earlier and much later than 476.
Sources frame it that way, seeing late antiquity as a complex period of transformation.
So why did Rome survive so long through so many crises?
Sources point to its remarkable strength and flexibility. It overcame existential threats by learning from its mistakes, thinking practically, and adapting its political structure from kingdom to republic to empire, and eventually, in the West, the papacy inherited much of its temporal authority. The constant threat of fall was always there, as one source puts it, but so was Rome.
When the Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 AD, sources suggest the average citizen might not have even noticed much change initially.
Right. The Senate in Rome still convened. The new king Odoacer was Christian and ruled Italy with the legal approval of the emperor in Constantinople. Life had already been significantly harder than during the Pax Romana centuries earlier, so the fall had, as one source notes, already been happening for a while. There was still a long way to drop.
And Rome City itself endured, becoming the seat of the popes.
Becoming a city of cathedrals built amongst the ruins. Even the Gothic kingdom of Italy under Theodoric, who overthrew Odoacer, was remarkably effective. Sources note Theodoric was more effective and arguably more Roman than most late Roman emperors, restoring infrastructure and boosting the Senate. He used diplomacy to establish influence over other successor kingdoms, a process one source calls, "damn was it impressive."
So, while the western half fractured, the eastern half, with Constantinople as its capital, survived 476 AD. This continued for another 1,000 years, becoming known to historians as the Byzantine Empire.
What makes Byzantium legitimately Roman? Sources are clear. They called themselves Romaioi, meaning Romans. Their capital was Nova Roma. They consciously maintained Roman institutions, Senate law, bureaucracy, army structure, emperor, although Greek became the primary language.
It was the language spoken by much of the Eastern Empire already.
Exactly. In the 6th century, we see Emperor Justinian, who rose from humble beginnings through the military.
And his famous and powerful love interest, Theodora, a celebrated actress before marrying Justinian. Sources portray them as an ultimate power couple.
They faced challenges, though. Sources highlight a traumatic event during Justinian's reign, the Nico riots in Constantinople. Hippodrome factions united in protest against taxes and officials.
Showing the people still had some sway. The old SPQR idea.
Sources suggest so. It became an effective way to express political discontent. Theodora played a crucial, indeed legendary role. When Justinian was ready to flee, Theodora stood firm, delivering a powerful speech culminating in the famous line, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud."
Wow. She convinced him to stay.
She did. A moment one source praises with a resounding, "Yes, Vasilisa, slay why," calling her the biggest Hellenic badass this side of Cleopatra. Justinian stayed and brutally suppressed the revolt, killing tens of thousands in the Hippodrome, demonstrated imperial power, but also citizen sway.
Justinian's reign also saw a remarkable Byzantine cultural renaissance, most famously the Hagia Sophia.
The Church of Holy Wisdom. Sources call it one of the single most beautiful sites. It evolved from standard basilica designs, featuring a massive dome pierced by windows, creating an effect of the dome floating on light, Justinian reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." Its design had a profound influence.
Justinian also pursued his ambitious reconquest of the West, aiming to paint the map purple again. He put his greatest general, Belisarius, in charge.
Belisarius is described by sources simply as a boss. He reclaimed Carthage and North Africa from the Vandals in under a year with minimal casualties, awarded a triumph rare for non-emperors.
The reconquest of Italy from the Ostrogoths proved much trickier, though.
Lasting nearly 2 decades, Belisarius made careful progression using inventive tactics like storming Naples through an aqueduct. He eventually pushed into Rome itself, which sources note made Hannibal look like a chump. As one source emphasizes, marching on Rome is a right reserved only to Roman generals.
The Goths counterattacked.
Besieged Rome for over a year, but Belisarius held out. The war continued north. The Byzantine army under Justinian is described as highly trained professionals. However, Justinian faced challenges, splitting forces between west and east when Persia invaded Mesopotamia.
And the Justinianic plague struck.
Ravaged both empires. Sources note the empire likely would have collapsed but for Theodora keeping things together while Justinian was in a plague coma. Rome City itself suffered terribly during the Gothic Wars, sacked again, becoming nearly a ghost town. Belisarius had to reconquer Italy multiple times.
Ravenna became a key Byzantine center, preserving art like mosaics.
Yes, developing that distinct golden aesthetic. Italy remained precariously held, and the Lombards invaded later, swiping 2/3 of it.
Byzantium, after Justinian, experienced ups and downs.
Described by one source as fluctuating somewhere between A and oof, Emperor Maurice was deposed by the incompetent Phocas. This provoked the Persian king Khosrow II to declare war and push deep into Byzantine territory, capturing Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt.
Until Heraclius arrived.
Son of the Exarch of North Africa. Sailed to Constantinople, booted Phocas, took control, instituted reforms, combined civil-military authority, made the empire more flexible, repelled the massive Persian threat, laying groundwork for the Themes system.
But this victory was immediately followed by the sudden rise of the Muslim Caliphate.
Neither exhausted Byzantium nor Persia could stop their rapid expansion. In just years, they conquered the Levant, Egypt, and the entire Sassanid Empire, broke the Rome-Persia status quo. By the end of the 7th century, Byzantines were largely shut out of the southern Mediterranean.
And Slavic forces pushed into Greece.
Into the Peloponnese, splitting Greece in half for a time, leaving the empire looking like a checkerboard. Sources dryly note the time-honored Roman tradition of spectacular territorial implosion is alive and well.
Despite these crises, their survival for another 1,000 years is incredible.
Sources attribute this to adaptation and learning. They were crucial in preserving ancient Greek texts. The Library of Constantinople did a hard carry. They maintained that fundamentally Roman capacity to adapt.
Constantinople's defenses were key, right? The Theodosian walls.
Functionally impenetrable. Plus, hundreds of underground cisterns. No city on Earth was better defended. Military reforms in the 6th, 7th centuries were crucial. The themata, or themes,
Governor also the general local citizen armies funded by land grants.
giving soldiers a tangible stake. Empire shrank, but the core became a militarized fortress, stronger and safer. They also produced military manuals like the Strategicon, Army Upgraded, Scutitoi Infantry, Toxotai Archers, and the famed heavy cavalry.
The Cataphractoi, full metal cavalry.
Both horse and rider and heavy-scale armor. Originated against Parthians, became core against Arabic cavalry. Infantry archers weaken, cataphracts hammer through. I just like saying cataphractos.
The navy was also important.
Pretty beefy for a coastal empire. Used the Duran and evolved trireme, upgraded with lateen sails, catapults, ballistae, and Greek fire siphons. Protected coasts and trade, though couldn't stop all Muslim incursions into islands like Crete or Sicily.
Culturally, the iconoclasm controversy was a major upheaval.
8th and 9th centuries, Emperor Leo III, I thought venerating images was idolatry, began smashing mosaics, frescoes, statues. Constantine V persecuted opponents. Pope, horrified, contributed to East-West split. Ravenna declared independence, saving its mosaics. Reinstated, then re-outlawed by Empress Theodora, a later one, in 843. Final rules. 2D icons, okay. Statues banned.
Impacted Byzantine art style significantly.
Hugely. Moved away from realism towards stylized figures, lots of gold. Governs Eastern Orthodox art today. We lament destroyed art, but comfort in 1,500-plus years continuity of style it solidified. Unexpectedly, iconoclasm also spurred reforms like the Thamata system formalization.
After iconoclasm, the Macedonian dynasty led to a golden age.
2 centuries of prosperity peace, late 9th to 11th century, peak prestige, handled Muslims, used religious diplomacy, pacified Bulgarians, converted Prince Volodymyr of Kievan Russes to Orthodox Christianity.
Setting Eastern Europe's path towards Cyrillic alphabet and Orthodox Christianity.
Largely. Got crucial Russes soldiers in return. Constantinople flourished as a cosmopolis, the keystone city. Roman-style churches, hippodrome, marble, center of trade culture with Italian quarters, even a mosque. Byzantine architects built cathedrals, monasteries.
Even rivals adopted the style.
Venice, Normans, oddest frenemies. St. Mark's in Venice, Palatine Chapel in Palermo are examples. St. Sophia in Kiev, pride of Ukraine. But political cracks appeared. Empire comfy on defense, the modest system bloat, officials complacent, bureaucrats ignored problems, blamed each other, did exactly nothing. Emperors relied more on mercenaries.
Leading to disaster at Manzikert in 1071.
Against Seljuk Turks. Entirely avoidable outcome from miscalculations, lost much of Anatolia. Byzantines kind of shrugged and let them have the rest. By 1075, empire never been smaller or weaker.
And the formal East-West schism in 1054.
Relations frayed for centuries. Justinian's one church, one empire failed. Byzantine authority in Rome nominal. Papal states split formal in 754. Communication tricky. Few spoke Latin Greek. Iconoclasm exacerbated disagreements on papal supremacy versus Byzantine independence. Fundamentally incompatible. Roman delegate excommunicated Byzantine church in Hagia Sophia during service. Greeks responded. Final split. Despite setbacks, Komnenos' dynasty, Alexios I of 1081, saw a remarkable revival. Held empire steady, new trade deals Venetians, planned to regain Anatolia.
Which led to the Crusades.
Alexios asked Pope Urban II for mercenaries, offering papal supremacy recognition, to help reconquer Anatolia. Urban sent European bandits to retake the Holy Land. Source exclaims, that wasn't the plan at all. Alexios had to wrangle this box of oops all crusaders, point them to Jerusalem so they didn't dare us vault all over his empire instead.
Crusaders more interested in their own lands? Meanwhile, Alexios' daughter, Anna Komnene,
wrote epic history of his reign. First woman historian. Absolute literary badass. Byzantine resilience shines through. Precarious, but hey, could've been a lot worse. Got knocked down, kept trying. Golden Ages dawn unexpectedly. Long history.
So the Byzantines survived 476 AD, continued another 1,000 years, but survival involved new struggles, particularly with Italian merchant empires like Venice and Genoa. Trade competition led to friction.
And Byzantine actions, like arresting, murdering tens of thousands of Latins in Constantinople in 1182, poured the proverbial Greek fire on the problem, escalating tensions.
An imperial crisis in the early 13th century led to Alexios the Angelos seeking help from the Fourth Crusade gathered at Venice.
He promised funds he didn't have. Sources lay out Alexios Komnenos' declassified crusading survival guide. Rule #1, don't ask crusaders for help. Rule #2, transport them ASAP. Rule #3, never provoke them in your empire.
The Angeloi failed spectacularly on all rules in 1204.
Delayed payment, provoked crusaders stuck outside. Crusaders, egged on by Venice, saw opportunity, sacked the city instead. Byzantines really should have known better.
The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was horrific.
Sources describe it as a rough approximation of literal hell on earth. Desolated art architecture. Venetians stole relics instead of burning. Good sense. Trashed or taken. Constantinople ruined. Rest of empire. Next on the to-thieve list.
Empire carved up. Venice took islands. Franks installed Latin emperor, carved up Greece. On paper, Byzantine Empire breaks right here.
But Byzantine persistence endured. Nobles fled, carved out successor states, Trebizond, Nicaea, Epirus, havens for Greeks. Latin Empire proved a temporary money pot. Franks got bored.
Nitian Byzantines reconquered Constantinople in 1261, kind of by accident.
Small scouting party found Frankish army out, snuck through wall break, open gate, took city. RNG worked just this once. Emperor Michael VIII, Palaiologos, found city in terrible disrepair. Palaiologos dynasty faced constant problems, shrinking empire, inconsistent resources, infighting.
They adapted military again with the Pronoia system.
Applied taxation system to military. Heavy cavalry got local tax rates instead of pay equipment. Emperor-controlled contracts. Militarized version of the tax-farming publicani system from way back in the Republic. Infantry became absolutely worthless.
Civil wars continued, became regular fusterclucks. Ex-Empress Anna pawned empire's crown jewels for warships in civil war against empire. Baby Emperor John V. Palaiologos challenged by John Cantacuzanos.
Ended with Cantacuzenus as co-emperor, but civil war severely weakened state. This period saw the rise of the Ottomans. One of many Anatolian beyliks, named Rum, from Arabic Turkish for Rome, shows they were in Roman orbit. State of Osman Bey, most adept dynamic. Started near Nicaea,
Riverage military skill, diplomacy, plague.
recast Eastern Roman world in a century. Sources emphasize Ottomans not Roman like Byzantines, Sunni Muslim state, unique institutions, but part of society's moving toward Roman orbit center. Last in long line of familiar situation. Roman world a lush and expansive grove. Societies fancied themselves emperors.
Final struggles. Shrinking empire, dependent on Italian traders, internal power struggles, rebuilding impossible, picked battles, bided time, even put themselves under Ottoman protection.
Shockingly different for a Roman emperor, Peloponnese, Morea, became Byzantine stronghold. Last emperor Constantine the Elec crowned in Mistras, not capital.
The end came in 1453. Ottomans didn't stop. Sultan Mehmed II had cannons size of a house.
Blockaded Bosphorus, cut supply, blast open Theodosian walls, poured in. Emperor Constantine Zizelic gave speech, charged in, never seen again. Did I say less? Yeah, about that. Sultan toured city, awed by Hagia Sophia, preserved it, converted to mosque rather than blasting it and starting from scratch.
Sources note irony that Venice, despite 1204 treachery, played vital part preserving Byzantine culture by stealing art now in Western museums.
An uncomfortable thing to say out loud, but true. Legacy endured. Greeks in Constantinople ruling empire gone. The Byzantines endured so long through tireless determination to do their best, create next mini golden age. Endured after Rome fell 476. Endured after Constantinople fell 1204. Greeks, Romai, endured.
History of Rome. Origins by Tiber to fall of Basileia Romaeon, the last true Roman state. But legacy, ideas, people carried on.
In West, Latin law, art, politics persisted adapted. In East, Byzantine civilization influenced vast regions. Even when states died, ideas and people carried on, adapting Roman identity. Rome always adapts its final great transformations.
Legacy reached far beyond Mediterranean. Roman Christianity spread. Muslim caliphate inherited adapted Roman administrative structures, culture. So from mythical twins and wolf mothers wrestling by the Tiber to emperors defending thousand-year-old walls against cannons the size of houses, what an incredible, turbulent journey. We've seen the Romans create an extraordinary civilization, fueled by this persistent, evolving idea of themselves, but constantly grappling with internal conflict, ambition, and relentless external threats.
Right. What stands out across this entire long history is that Rome didn't just build things out of brick and stone. They built their civilization out of adaptation, resilience, and often a brutal pragmatism.
Yeah, that ability to learn.
Their ability to learn, sometimes painfully, from their mistakes, whether it was Cannae, the Gracchi brothers, or the 3rd century crisis, is astonishing and key to their longevity.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see how this idea of Rome wasn't a fixed thing. It constantly shifted, from a republic valuing teamwork to an empire requiring a single powerful leader.
And then how that idea fractured, survived, and transformed dramatically in the East, in the successor kingdoms of the West, and in the city of Rome itself, long after any traditional fall dates.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. When we look at this long, complex, and often violent story of Rome, constantly staring down oblivion and refusing to die, what does that persistence, adaptability, and capacity for reinvention tell us about how societies navigate constant change and crisis today?
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn from the Romans, isn't there?